Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Planning and Development Committee meeting of July 19th, 2023 to order. First off, I will read the land acknowledgement. Niagara Region and Grimsby are situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Hattah-Wendoronk, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The regional municipality of Niagara and the town of Grimsby stand with all Indigenous people, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live. Any disclosures of interest? No. Seeing none, need a mover and seconder for approval of the agenda. Moved by Councillor Frey, second by Councillor Bradsey. Moved by Councillor Frey, second by Councillor Bradsey. Resolved that the July 19th, 2023 Planning and Development Committee agenda be approved. All in favor? That's carried. All right, need a mover and seconder for receipt of previous minutes. Moved by Member Drew. Second by Member Frake.
No, member.
No, Councillor Frake, sorry.
I remember all right.
Yeah. Moved by Member Drew, second by Councillor Frake. Resolved that the June 6th, 2023 Planning and Development Committee minutes be received. All in favor? That's carried. Need a mover and seconder for Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee. Moved by Member Drew, second by Councillor Bradsey. And Bianca was going to speak to it? Or not?
Under verbal update.
Okay, under the verbal update, all right. Moved by Member Drew, second by Councillor Bradsey. Resolved that the July 11th, 2023 Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee minutes be received. All in favor? And that's carried. Now we welcome Bianca for the verbal update on Main Street East Heritage Conservation District. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you through the chair. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Katie. So on July 11th, we had our Municipal Heritage Committee meeting where we discussed the results of the Heritage Conservation District study that has been being undertaken on the Main Street East corridor. So this is just an overview of my presentation, and then we will provide some opportunities for questions at the end. So first I'm going to be speaking to the purpose of the Main Street East study. I'm going to provide an overview of the phases and where we are now, the recommendations for designation, potential steps forward in the designation process. I'm also going to provide an example of a district policy so you can see a more stringent and something that's a little bit more watered down example. And then we're going to have an overview of the available tools that we can implement to protect the identified value. And then we're going to do an overview of some of the key issues raised. I'm going to provide you an overview of the recommendation from Heritage Committee, and then we'll talk about some of the next steps. Thanks. So the purpose of the study, so this is the study area for the Main Street East corridor. So during the evaluation, the goal was to identify the cultural heritage value within the corridor, and then the consultants prepared recommendations on the best way to protect the identified value. So I'm going to be going over some of those recommendations, but ultimately that was the goal of the study and the intent of the first phase. So, next slide, Katie. So this speaks more to the two phases. So the first phase of the study, I just wanted to quickly go over the purpose, community involvement, and then the outcome for each of the phases. So we've just completed the first phase, which was the study phase. The purpose of this phase was to identify the historical value of the corridor and if an HCD was warranted under the Heritage Act. The community involvement, they provided data, their stories, and helped us to identify the values within the corridor. And the outcome of the first phase is to have a recommended boundary for the HCD. During the second phase, during the second phase, if council chooses to proceed, we will design a plan and create guidelines to help manage change within the corridor. We will also have the community provide significant feedback on the policies. Our goal is to make sure that the policies that are put in place within this corridor work for the homeowners. And the outcome of this will be council will review this plan that's put together with the consultants and the community, and then implement the HCD plan and guidelines. And just a reminder, we won't move to phase 2 unless council directs us to. Next slide, please. So these are recommendations from our consultants. So the map is the original study area broken up into sub-characters. So the downtown is in blue, the historic residential core is in the green, the orange is Nels to Boslaw corridor, and then the character area of the east end is in the brown color. It's a little hard to see, but the purple is the designated properties within the corridor, and then the light purple is the registered buildings. A bigger picture of this is available in the attached report. So I've highlighted in with the green circle the historic residential core. That is the area being recommended for the district. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that those are individual properties that are being recommended for designation. And so you'll notice a lot of these properties are not within that historic residential core. And that's because the value identified within the corridor either suited cluster designation as a district or was better suited for individual. So the ones in the chart were better suited for individual, while the one highlighted with the green circle was better suited for cluster designation. Next slide, please. So now I want to just provide an overview on where we are today. So first we commenced the HCD study. We've now received the study findings and recommendations. Last Tuesday, we took the recommendations from the consultants to the Municipal Heritage Committee. The Municipal Heritage Committee, just for everyone's reference, is established through the Ontario Heritage Act, and their role is to provide guidance to council on heritage-related matters. And so that discussion was very based on technical merit and the importance of this corridor or this identified sub-character meeting the threshold under the Ontario Heritage Act criteria. So we also brought this to Planning Committee for their review, and if they'd like to provide additional recommendations to council, they can. Then this will proceed to council on August 8th, and then council will decide to continue to move forward in the process or decide not to. If council directs us to move forward, then we will work with the consultants to commence the second phase, and that's where we'll prepare the HCD plans and guidelines. So within this stage, there'll be 2 to 3 engagement opportunities, but I've noted on the top of the slide that while there'll be 4 to 7 additional engagement steps within this process, staff invite property owners to reach out for additional opportunities. So if council proceeds with the next step, we'll be sending out a letter to each of the residents, or property owners, I should say, to meet with staff one-on-one to make sure their voices are being heard through this process. So once that process is complete, we'll bring to council an HCD plan and designation bylaw for them to consider. If council chooses to move forward, then the designation bylaw will be passed, and then notice will be served to all of the property owners, and there will be an objection period at the end. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so now I wanted to go over the development of this HCD plan. So this is just an example to show you how customizable it is. So we have on the left side the least stringent, and then the right side the most stringent. So I'll start at the beginning. So maybe we want to just put demolition protection on the Main Street East corridor. So that would be the least stringent. And then maybe we want to add a couple more things and add in guidelines for new additions and guidelines for new builds. Or we can go more stringent and add protection for character-defining elements like porches, wooden details, also known as fretwork, windows, wooden windows, window openings. And then again, we could have the guidelines for the new builds and the guidelines for the additions. And then we could go even more stringent, and we could do demolition protection. We could provide protection to the character-defining elements. We could have guidelines for new additions, guidelines for new builds. We can provide options for paint colors. We could pick materials for roofing, or we can pick exterior finishes. So that kind of shows you how customizable the actual plan can be. So if the homeowners find that, a more protections that are a little bit more watered down work for them, then that is something that we can consider moving forward to and having council review. So this just kind of shows you how custom it can be, and I think those one-on-one sessions will really help us get a gauge of what all of the property owners want to see. And if council does move forward, the goal here is to make a plan that works for everyone. And then the level of stringency, so all of those items listed above would be enforced through heritage permits. So when a property owner goes through the process of applying for a building permit, it'll automatically be flagged, and then heritage staff will help them through this process and be here to support them. There's also opportunities we could look at where certain things are delegated for internal review. So there's a lot of options still. So I just wanted to give an example. Next slide. Okay, so now I wanted to provide an overview of the available tools. So on the far left, you'll see the existing protections within the corridor. So we have our official plan policies, we have our zoning bylaw. There's only 3 properties within the historic residential core that are designated, and then 26 of the properties within the historic residential core are on the municipal heritage register. And I think this is really important to note because of all of those very important buildings within that corridor, 26 of those buildings will lose protection by January 1, 2025. And this is because of Bill 23. So if we were not to move forward at all, our protection in place in that corridor would be the official plan policies, the zoning bylaw, and the 3 individual designations. And then those registered properties by January 1, 2025 will be removed. So now we have some options for everyone to consider, and ultimately council will make the decision to move forward. So option 1 is we have the existing official plan policies, we have the existing zoning bylaw, and then we do additional individual designations. And I just wanted to note, when I put in additional individual designations, I'm speaking to within the corridor as well as the greater study area. Option 2 is a little bit more of a layered approach, and this may be a good scenario if we went with a heritage conservation district that was not as stringent. Then we could layer additional individual designations on top. So we have the official plan, the zoning bylaw, then we would have the heritage conservation district and whatever plan is established, and then we would also look at the additional individual designations. And this is the approach being recommended by staff, as we feel it will ensure the protection of the identified value. And then there's option 3, where we move forward with the official plan, the zoning bylaw. Sorry, those are already in place. But the additional protection would be the heritage conservation district and no additional designations. And then I also noted that future mandatory enhancements will be made to the official plan and zoning bylaw as we work to come into conformity with the new legislation. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on these, the key issues raised. I did my best to put a summary of them in here, but my report did have more. So we talked about at Heritage Committee quite a bit the historic residential core's merit for designation. So the historic residential core was identified as a notable corridor containing heritage resources from the 19th and 20th century. These are some of the best examples of surviving heritage resources from the height of the tender fruit farming industry. And we also see that during the 20th century, the area continued to evolve, and we see popular architectural styles and buildings come into that corridor as well. And then we have the financial impacts. This is a really important piece, and we want to make sure we're here to support the homeowners. We've been working on all three of these items quite a bit in one-on-one consultation with homeowners. So if homeowners are facing specific concerns, we really encourage them to speak to us so that we can help them. So we have been working towards creating supportive materials for property insurance, property value, and restoration projects. Staff work with property owners to ensure that all the restoration projects are completed in accordance with best practice. This ensures that restoration work is done well and that the property owner will get the most out of that restoration. We also provide this to homeowners, one-on-one consultation if they're having issues with their buildings, and we provide them with conservation plans forward, and we can work with them to create restoration plans. We've also been working a lot with property owners on property insurance. We've been working on a living document where property owners are telling us their successful stories and not so successful stories, and we're trying to work towards having insurance companies that they've had really positive experiences with that we can share with other residents or other property owners. And we've also been working with the insurance industry to better understand the difference between the underwriters and the brokers that are bringing forward these plans. So we've been working really close with the property owners on that, and that will continue to evolve. And then I also wanted to talk about the rise in costs for heritage restoration. So currently we do have a grant, but staff is working on some additional incentives for council to consider, which would set up kind of yearly plans for residents to use incentives for wood windows, for repointing, new roofs, painting, that kind of thing. So we're working on that right now. But again, if residents can share with us, or property owners, I should say, the concerns they're having, we're happy to try to address those through the new incentives. The current program is a regional matching grant, so the region pays half and then the town pays half. So we want to ensure that when that program comes up in October, that there is appropriate incentives in place. So that's all a part of that discussion. And then impacts on property owners. As I noted in the previous slide, we want consultation to help develop the level of stringency for the plan. And so our goal is to enable the cultural value to be protected and remain in the landscape, but also that the homeowners are not being impacted by this. So I think my goal is that we collectively come up with something that works for everyone. Next slide, please. So now I'll give you a brief overview of the Heritage Committee recommendation. So the Heritage Committee is recommending that the sub-character area known as the Historic Residential Core be designated under Part 4 of the Heritage Act. And at the Heritage Committee, we received correspondence from the property at 133 to 137 Main Street East. And they were inquiring if the modern layer could be removed from the boundary, but the historic home would stay in the boundary. So staff are currently working with the town's legal counsel to provide counsel with some options on this. Ultimately, staff and Heritage Committee want to ensure that the restoration of the heritage building is not delayed in any way by this study. So their recommendation was that the boundary be for the designated area be established following the review of options for the property at 133 to 137 Main Street East, and that staff work with the consultants to commence the second phase of the study and develop the associated district plan and guidelines, and that the properties in Appendix B, which were the designated properties on the list, be considered for designation following the impacts of Bill 23. And that prioritization for Part 4 designation, which is individual designations, for properties within the downtown core be prioritized. Next slide. And then here are some summaries of next steps. So the recommendations from Heritage Committee and potentially Planning Committee will be considered by Council on August 8th. And if Council proceeds with the second phase, then the second phase of the study will commence, And we will work towards scheduling those engagement activities for all of the property owners. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation, Bianca. Just before I receive any questions, I'll just get a mover and seconder to get the resolution on the floor. Moved by Councillor Frake, second by Member Drew. Questions? Councillor Frake.
Thank you, Bianca. That's a good overview. I'd just like to say, first of all, this is probably one of the most controversial things we have to deal with over the last term. And I think a lot of it was due to a lot of misunderstandings. And I think it's great. I think we need to put that behind us. I think we're kind of starting all over, right? With this new study. Are we using the same information we got from the last term in this study?
Through the chair, so the study the project, I'll say, is broken up into two phases. So the first phase is the study phase, and that's very much a technical evaluation from a legislative criteria standpoint. So the first phase is all about collecting the value of the site of the corridor, and the evaluation is conducted against the criteria to see if the area actually merits protection as a district. So that's the intent of the first phase. Where the second phase now is actually, okay, we identified the value in the first phase, how do we want to protect it now? And so that's where the community is going to get really involved in how they see their corridor evolving and what works for them and what doesn't.
Do we need a heritage corridor or district? If we didn't, why do we need to have the district? Why can't it be house by house rather than designating a district and every house in that district becomes tied up in the Heritage Act and what we decide here on council? Can that just be a piecemeal? Does it have to be a district that we have to put in place? I mean, I think we don't have a district over Main Street West, and that seems to work. So why do we need to have one on Main Street East?
Through the chair, Katie, could you just share the screen? I had the option. It was one of the options to proceed with individual designations.
I think we just need to clear up the miscommunication.
Yeah, so I don't know if that'll help that slide, but there is a few options on how to proceed forward. The direction from council was to commence the study. So these are the results from that evaluation. But the evaluation told us we can move forward with a district here. It meets the threshold. So it's up to council now if they want to proceed with a district there. Otherwise, I'm recommending that some type of protection be implemented in that corridor, whether that be the district or individual designation prior to that January 1, 2025. Because after that time, all the buildings that were on the register, so every building within that corridor except for the 3 that are designated, are left with no protection. So if a demolition permit comes in for any of those estates, nothing can stop it from a municipal perspective.
Okay, along the same line, if the district is established and there's quite a few buildings, houses, et cetera, in that district. So if anyone who doesn't have a heritage house wants to do some renovations or make some changes, do they have to jump through hoops through the heritage process to do that? Or what would be the process for them? I mean, if I have a modern house, I don't live on Main Street, but if I was caught up in that district, if I need to do something to my house, do I get caught up in this particular district process?
Through the chair, Katie, if you could just put up the slide again. This one is for where you can pick the level of stringency.
I know that.
I think it's helpful when you have the actual examples. So if you could share that one. So if it would say the first one where it was demolition protection, it would be a heritage permit asking to demolish the house. And so that would come through council to approve the demolition of the house. Council could also delegate authority to staff to say modern buildings can be demolished within the corridor but the community might want to have guidelines for new additions or new builds. So any structure within that corridor, whether it be historic or new, the community might want them to follow specific guidelines. But none of those guidelines have been established yet. That will be in the second phase. So it really depends on what the community chooses. So if they went with wanting guidelines for additions and wanting guidelines for new builds, then they would get a heritage permit to do this, and they would go through that process, and staff help them through the whole process. And again, it's up to council if they want to delegate certain things to staff, or if they wanted to go through council.
Sorry to the chair. My apologies, I didn't follow that protocol earlier. But my point is, if you have a modern house, a younger house in that district, and you want to make changes to it, once this district is in place, does everyone have to go through an extra process to do something to their house?
Through the chair. So again, it depends on what they put in place. So if there's rules in the guidelines for new builds, say new builds need to go to council for approval on putting on garages or for adding a second floor, then they go through the heritage permit process to go to council to get permission to add the second floor or to add the garage. So it would be the same as if a historic homeowner applied for something.
When you say new build, you're talking about a house that's being built from the ground up? Or are you talking about a house that's having additions or renovations to it?
Through the chair, I'm sorry, I'm saying modern infill, more modern buildings.
Okay, so so they're all covered, and a brand-new house or just being built or being built from scratch, or houses that are there that need renovations or whatever?
Through the chair, again, it depends on the guidelines. So the community might want there to be guidelines on new builds so that it's compatible with the corridor. Because the intent of a heritage conservation district is to preserve the collective value of that area. So when you're adding in new layers, you want to ensure that the overall value of that corridor is not being impacted. So that could be any change. So the district is intended to guide that change. So if they put restrictions or I should say guidelines in the plan, they may say, again, like if a second story is to be added to an existing building, then council should review it for impacts to the heritage.
You say community, are you saying that the community is going to decide this or council is going to decide this?
So the community will work with the consultants to establish the plan. And then once that plan is established in consultation with the community, it will come before council for consideration. Ultimately, council will approve the final details of that plan. And then once it's in place, that's our tool to guide change in the corridor. So whatever's in there, if there's something someone has to do, the heritage permit will be used to enforce it.
Okay, so I don't want to hog the limelight here, but financially, from a financial perspective, anyone who has a heritage house or not in that district, I mean, some folks will have heritage houses and they can't afford, because a heritage house is quite costly to upkeep. And I'm sure there's a few people in this room tonight that have that situation. And they fall under these rules and they can't find the natural materials or the heritage materials to go into their house because it's a huge cost. Mm-hmm. So I think you mentioned, I think that's going to be addressed, how we help the homeowners financially. And I know this has been an ongoing discussion, which hasn't been established yet and hasn't been agreed on yet. But someone buys a house, it's a lot of money. I mean, it's a huge, it's the biggest investment a person will make in their life. And then all of a sudden they get hung up on heritage rules where they have to have put this extra amount of financial burden on keeping the property heritage. So if we're going to put that stringent rules in place, then we certainly have to be right there beside them, getting the grants or whatever they need to financially help them do those things. So I think we're going to be talking about that, is that right? That's one of the, because I think you mentioned it in one of your steps forward there.
Yeah, through the chair, I understand all of those issues that homeowners have and just how daunting these heritage buildings can be. And I think, yes, there's that perspective of putting in the modern materials and it's perceived we want to keep it heritage, but a lot of time it comes down to the characteristics of the heritage materials don't always agree with the modern materials. So we work with homeowners to make sure that the mortars they're adding won't eventually crack the softer brick. So those are more of the discussions we're having rather than really trying to control what the material is. It's more about a compatibility, and we're here to support them to make sure that that restoration work that they're doing is actually the best for the building. So someone could repoint their building and use harsh concrete mortars and not know, where if they came to staff, we'd say, you need to use a soft type K mortar. And then that brick, when movement occurs on the site, it won't be the sacrificial piece, the mortar will be. So then there's less cost down the road. So they're not replacing all their masonry, instead they're repointing with the mortar. So those are the discussions that we're having, and that's the goal of this toolkit. It's not to make the property owners have to jump through hoops. It's to make sure the restoration work they're doing is best for the building. But if they can't find a material or they're having difficulty obtaining tradespeople, we understand those struggles and we will work with them to make sure we can have a positive outcome from the building. It's more about the compatibility of materials from our perspective than it is what keeping it heritage. It's more about making sure that they have the longevity.
So if it cosmetically looks good and is functional, then that's okay?
That's our goal, yeah, through the
Okay.
chair. That's our goal.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to hog the, I'll come back later. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. Through the chair, I want to thank the Heritage Committee. I was given the opportunity to be a delegate at the meeting, so I had the opportunity to ask questions of Stantec as well as the staff. But I have one additional question, and this deals not with the Heritage District, but with the downtown area as it was labeled in the study. My understanding is the staff will be receiving all of the information from Stantec related to the downtown area, and you've laid out the specific timeline in which you have to review some 25 properties prior to 2025. And the question is, if council proceeds with the recommendation, has staff reviewed the amount of work that would remain in the downtown area in terms of studying each of approximately 25 properties and then making appropriate recommendation related to whether those would be designated prior to the deadline of 2025?
Through the chair, so right now there's over 530 properties within the town of Grimsby that will lose protection by January 1, 2025. So staff have been working on creating a priority list. So right now we're doing a lot of work on Main Street West. And based on what we've found, we're about 6 months in, and collectively we have about 30 to 39 reports complete. And again, for everyone's reference, the average municipality designates 1 to 3 buildings a year. So it is a massive undertaking to assess these resources. So our goal is to prioritize in kind of groupings. So right now we're doing Main Street West, and so we'd like to continue to move down. So we would, do Main Street, the downtown together would be our hope for that. We're also balancing our most important buildings and our most vulnerable buildings. So our hope is to get to all of our most important buildings, which some are in the downtown. So we'll continue to keep council updated on that progress. But it is definitely a substantial undertaking. Those properties could take 6 months. So, thank you.
If I could, through the chair, follow up to that then. The section that's proposed to be a Heritage Conservation District, then because it's designated that way, is exempt from that 2025 deadline? Is that my understanding?
Through the chair, only if the district's in place in time. Otherwise, it will not be.
Thank you.
Councillor Bradzi.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I've got to say, I absolutely agree. We need to do something to help homeowners financially. but I'm along with some other councillors, struggling to see the value of the district. So we said there's 4 houses designated in the district, but 26 on the register. Approximately how many are in the district in total? Did you know?
Through the chair, are you asking for heritage or properties in general? I know there was over 300 in the total study area. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how many, but I know there was 26 that were on the register, and then 3 are designated. So we know for certain there's probably about 30 heritage resources within that corridor, but there may be some more. But I know, I want to say it's roughly 50, but I'd have to double check.
Thank you. Through the chair. I think my issue with the district is just when you take a blanket application and you mentioned trying to make a plan that fits everyone. And I just go against with blanket applications and trying to make everybody fit into one category. I just don't see how that'll end up being possible. And I just try to think if we were to go through one by one, every house in the district, that the amount we would designate would probably, be in and around 20% on the lower scale number. So I just don't think adding in all these extra houses is a good use of our resources and time against the deadline, personally. But that being said, there are plenty heritage jewels in this district as well. So those are my comments.
Councillor Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions for clarification. You mentioned Bill 23, explain to me, how has Bill 23 affected this particular study? Or this particular district?
Through the chair, so through Bill 23, they introduced an entire new legislative criteria for heritage conservation districts. So the initial study phase was assessed twice. So it was assessed to the old criteria, and then on January 1 of 2023, the new criteria came through, and then the study area was further assessed. So the district actually merited protection the first time and the second time. So the recommendation to move forward for the district here is very defensible. And I know to Councillor Bradsy's comment there, I think it's a discussion between, do you want individual property protection, or do you want the entire corridor to be protected intact as a collection? And so I think that's the way to look at it. Both of those are options under the Heritage Act.
Yes, thank you. As I alluded to earlier, I feel kind of the same way as Councillor Baratsy. I think that it has to be, identify them one by one. But to put a blanket process or policy in place, I think is just not. I think we're kind of dictating too much to a lot of homeowners in the area, and we've had that conversation offline earlier this week. So hopefully that's the road we go down. I'm not really totally in favor of a heritage district, to be quite honest with you. There, I've said it. So the other thing was the development on the corner of Nels and Main, which is 133 Main Street.
Yeah.
Is that exempt from this now, or is that still? You mentioned it earlier in the presentation. So can you tell me where that is right now, or us, for that matter?
Yes, through you, the chair. So staff and the consultants feel strong that the heritage building on 133 should remain in the district because of its associative value. It's linked to these other resources. But we are talking to our legal counsel on options for the modern layer, if that is potentially included or not within the boundary. And so those recommendations from our legal counsel, we're hoping to bring those to council for their consideration, but we do still have time to establish the final boundary. That doesn't need to be done on the August 8th meeting.
So the house has already been established as heritage. So, and that has gone through a whole bunch of processes already, including the OLT, if I remember correctly. So does it still need to be a circle drawn around that house? Will that have any effect on the DeSantis moving ahead with his development, or will it have any effect on during the building process? Is it like every time he builds something on that property going forward, does he have to come to the Heritage Committee and get another approval? I know he has concerns about it because he's raised them quite, with all of us, for that matter, I'm sure you too. So can they just move ahead without getting caught up in all of this? I mean, because the house is already protected.
So through the chair, I think it's important to talk about timelines here. So they have all their approvals, so they can move forward
Okay.
for the official plan and zoning bylaw. I do think they still have a few more things they're working with the town on. They have their heritage permits, so from our perspective, they will be moving forward. And based on the time it will take to implement the second phase, I don't see there being any overlap, because this will take time to implement the second phase. But ultimately, staff and the Heritage Committee feel really strongly that that heritage building cannot be impacted by this. It has to move forward, it has to be restored. So we will work with council to make sure there isn't any impacts to that. If the timelines do cross over, but as I noted, it will take a while to implement this.
Okay. My final question, Mr. Chair, is if we go with a heritage district, and in that heritage district, there's a lot of commercial buildings and plazas along that strip as well, do they, going forward, will they get caught up in something needs to be developed there? I mean, are we going to use the heritage district to contain those plazas that are there now? Hopefully not. I don't want to weaponize this particular heritage district if we go down that road. So are they exempt from this? I mean, any of the commercial buildings?
Through the chair, just for clarification, are you talking about the ones across from 133?
Yeah. Sorry, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so they're not within the boundary. The boundary is the Nels Estate, 133, and the,
And west of there.
yeah, the house across the street, and then it goes down to Robinson Street. And then again, it just depends on what the guidelines are, if they need a heritage permit or not, but this is not intended to stop development. This is intended to guide it. So whatever we're putting in place as the protection, if it's just demolition, then if they're building something new, then it may not apply. If we put in things, provisions for guidelines for additions or new builds, it may apply. So if it does apply, then they'll go through the heritage permit process, but the intent of this tool is not to stop development, it's just to guide it. So we have an ability to say, we want to make sure that whatever is added to this corridor, it's compatible with what's there.
Okay. Thank you very much. You've done a great job, by the way. So I think we've come a long way since the last term on this particular subject in a shorter period of time. So hopefully we'll come to some conclusions soon, and I think we're getting there. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions? All right. Thank you again very much for your presentation, Bianca. And I just want to add that given the effects of Bill 23, I feel that council has a really difficult decision to make. But the decision I feel that we need to make is to save every possible heritage home and keep the fabric of the community, and whether it be through individual designation or the Heritage District, I think we need to make that decision, and I think we need to look at that January 1st, 2025 timeline, and we have to make that decision in consultation with staff to really do it in such a way where we don't lose any more heritage. And I'll leave it at that. Moved by Member Frake, second by moved by Councillor Frake, second by Member Drew. Resolved that the verbal update regarding the Main Street East Heritage Conservation District be received. All in favor? That's carried. All right, now we move to the first of our two delegations. Up first is Ron Van Pelt regarding Heritage Conservation District. Good evening, Ron. Up to the podium, please.
Perfect. First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to present tonight. Look, I don't live properly in the Heritage District, but I'm a big believer that if one study comes along, another study is going to come along, and it's going to probably come down to my end anyways. So as a result, there's a few things that I'm struggling with. And one of the things I look at is that if I look at the sheer numbers of designated properties in Main Street West, I think the total like 12 or 13 versus the corridor that you're just looking to basically designate. And when I look at all the protections you're putting on the register, there's 90 of them so far, as per the last document I have. So the question I have is, why are we doing a study on that area rather than where it should start, which is on the West Main Street? Don't have an answer for that, but I'm trying to figure it out because that's where it should start. If I pop on the Grimsby website, what pops up? Grimsby Beach. And then a whole bunch of pictures of Niagara, Main Street West homes. So why don't we start there? Now, we have studies, and studies cost a lot of money. I know that from my corporate life. And one study will lead to another study. And as a result, when I look at the data does not add up to have a study for this particular corridor. Start in the West. I can't answer that question, but the people organizing can. So you need to talk to the consultants because they should start there in the first place. So that's my issue. So that's number one. When I look at financial, and this is a concern to me. Now, I have a heritage home and I love my heritage home. Probably have the nicest heritage home in town. Bottom line is, how many people that are making decisions on our properties own a heritage home? Probably none. So as a result, until you're in the game, you're a spectator. You cannot continue to move goalposts on citizens that buy houses in good intent in a district before it becomes a district. Now you're playing with their retirement, you're playing with their asset, and regardless of what people tell me, real estate agents do not know how to sell a heritage property. I've gone through it. They don't want to touch it. And when people come in to see a heritage property, they automatically discount it. Why? Because of all the procedures and the bureaucracy associated with it. So they automatically discount it. Yeah, the reason why they're maintained? Because they have to be maintained. Because you've got to lien on a property. That's not fair. And as a result, what really bothers me, when people get between me and my money, or the designated people in their districts. It's not fair. You can't continue to move goalposts without any skin in the game. So financially, I look at it and I say, wow, we're working on some things. In my life, before you make a presentation and talk about changes, you have your toolkit together. That means tax relief in place, simplified grant process, established grant process. None of that's in place. We're still talking about it. You know, tax relief came in 2006. You're running around trying to designate, but you forgot the one thing. Why don't you get the tools in place so that you can get the buyers, the people that are affected, to buy in voluntarily? But right now, this year's gone. How many more years do I have to wait for tax relief? And there's 45 jurisdictions, municipalities around Ontario that have got it and have had it for a long time. That is where we should be focusing, folks. Bottom line is, you need to have that toolbox in place so that you guys can come to the designated one-on-one meetings and say, this is what we want to do, but we're prepared to do this. But none of you guys understand the skin in the game because it costs a lot of money and you're affecting people's livelihoods and their retirements. And that's not fair. Totally unfair. Now, I am lucky enough that I can afford to do my house. But I will tell you, I'm in the construction business. And I know that wood, to replace wood to wood versus composite, which will last 30 years, costs 20 to 30% more on average. That's in a good cycle. On a bad cycle we just had, 50 to 80% more. Vinyl siding can replace the wood cladding. I don't have to do painting every 3 to 5 years. I can't even get an oil-based stain anymore. So the paint isn't any good anymore to look after these old homes. Bottom line is, painting costs for a 2,500 square foot home, $7,500. That's from today's quote. My house, 12 grand. Again, costs that are not being considered when people are designating and making up districts. So, when I look at it and say, if I'm going to be sold what they want to do, what's the upside? Right now, I don't see a lot. Not for the people that are going to be potentially affected. And like I said earlier, one study leads to another study, two leads to another study, so one more district, one more district, one more district. I'm here because I don't want another district down there because I don't think it's fair to the homeowners that have bought their houses in good faith to be affected by another moving goalpost. Finally, we're finally talking about some transparency, we're getting it. But that should have started a long time ago. And I'm going through the little process of severing a portion of my lot. And the bottom line is, before the severance process started, no one cared about my trees. I could cut them down, but now I need a conservation study. No one cared about the fact that my heritage study that was done, impact study was done when 1985 isn't good enough anymore. Not a bunch of money. These are all things that just confound the average citizen. Bureaucracy, bureaucracy, bureaucracy. And let's face it, government does not save money. It adds cost. Personal thing, I appreciate everything the Historical Society is doing for me in terms of my grant. But I'm trying to hold my painter to paint my carriage house. I don't know if I'm going to get him. I'm going to have to start the whole process over again because he might not be able to do my work because it's taken 4 months. 4 months. It's going to be 5 months by the time we get to September. And I don't want to paint it when it's cold or wet because I'm going to do it all over again in another year. Can't do that. So when I finally find about the fact the last part is communication, transparency, I'm glad we're having one-on-ones. That should have been done in the first place. But I'm damn tired of consultants coming in and telling me what we can do and what we can't do with the properties. We should have had those conversations in one beautiful recap so that we could get what stakeholders in this town actually think and are concerned about. Transparency in education. Let's get the education. Because I know it costs more money to insulate or insure those homes, costs more money to maintain those homes. I know it costs more money to work through the processes of what gets approval for maintenance. Those are all things that consumers or stakeholders need to know about. We need to have those things on a regular basis. The last thing we need to do is have way more one-on-one meetings. Zoom meetings are great in business, but I like to read the room. You can't read the room on a Zoom call. Anybody in sales knows that. Bottom line is, people should have the right to go and see and say the point. The last point is, most of these old homes in these districts are owned by older people. They're not digitally inclined. They feel intimidated by it. But if you can get them out here, they'll say what's really on their mind. And that's what you need to know. Because how do you make a decision if you don't know what's on your stakeholders' minds? Can't do it. Possible. So when I look at it, simple next steps. Stop this study. If you're going to do a study, start on Main Street West. Use those $300,000 or ultimately $1 million, put it in a reserve, and set it up as an incentive fund to go and maintain the properties you currently have. Because what's going to happen? You're going to have a whole bunch of houses down like DeSantis, because those people are going to run out of money. And you're going to own them all, because you have a lien on the property. That's not good business. And finally, improved communication. Hallelujah, finally got some of that. One-on-ones. That's what's needed. And more meetings like this. Have the community come out and talk about it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get what you actually need to do to make the study worthwhile. But right now, that's where it should start if you're going to do a study. Not in the middle of the town. There's nothing there to sustain it. Other than that, those are my comments. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation, Ron. And questions or comments from the committee? Councillor Frake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ron lives in my ward, so I'm very familiar with this house, and it is one of the nicest heritage houses in town for sure. and I've toured it, and I can see what you're talking about when you talk about the amount of money to keep heritage. It's a huge undertaking, and it's a big commitment, and it's actually a project of love, really, when you think of it. So, but money doesn't come easy, and it has certainly costs have gone up. And you came up with a bunch of really good suggestions, which I'm sure that Bianca has already spoken to you about that or has written them down. I know you mentioned some that I know she's already considering. So you're right, communication is really, really important, but not just communication. It's got to be simplified communication, so when people get these, talk to people like yourself, that it's simplified to the fact where everybody understands what it is. And I know I get brochures in the mail from town once in a while, and I look at them, read them 10 times. I don't understand what the hell they're saying. So I think your comments are well, should be taken into consideration, which I'm sure they are. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
Just one clarification. Appreciate everything the town does. Don't get me wrong, I think Bianca has done a great job and some stuff for Barb and I. I will tell you, I love my house. My wife loves my house even more because it's really her house. It's her boy house. But the bottom line is, if we're going to move forward, we've got to think it out, guys. Because if you don't think it out, you got one chance at it, because you're going to alienate a lot of people, and it's going to cost a lot of people a lot of money. And sometimes no study is better than a study. And that's where I come from right now, because I don't think we know what we really want to do. And if we're just saving houses because we want to stop development, then you're going to stop progress. I'm not saying that you have to have modern monstrosities. God, I hate all those houses. But you can streetscape, and you can instruct builders that are getting their permits to streetscape. I'm in the business, I understand that. Good builders will follow along what the community is all about, because they sell community. Some of them don't. You don't want to be associated with those guys. But like I said, we have one shot to do this right. If we do it wrong, we're going to pay for it for a long time. That's all I got to say.
Any other questions? No? All right, so we have our second delegation up, Peter and Sandy Zuloff. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. We live at 111 Main Street East in Grimsby, and it's an older home. My wife and I grew up in heritage homes, but for a short time have spent most of our lives by choice living in old homes. Creaky floors and rattling doorknobs, and significant cost and attention needed to maintain the homes has not changed our view that the effort is offset by their character and charm. While we fully understand that there's a desire for communities to protect the heritage in their communities, we have also seen that there is a general public perception that the expenses associated with the maintenance of heritage designated homes should be borne solely by their owners, regardless of cost. Often those that most strongly voice their opinions in favor of heritage conservation districts and heritage designations do not themselves live in heritage homes, nor would they freely accept the imposition of the regulatory restrictions and associated expenses for their own homes. At present, it is our understanding that the Heritage Study has identified 4 areas in Grimsby, the only one being recommended is a core on each side of Main Street between Robinson and Nellis Road. In this area, as much as I know, approximately 25% of the 57 properties meet the criteria of the study, recommending a Heritage Conservation District designation. Of interest is that in speaking with some of our neighbors who live in contemporary homes that fall within the study criteria, none had any clear understanding of the study, nor that a Heritage Conservation District designation would not only be restricted to heritage properties, but their own properties as well. At present, there's a process at the municipal level which identifies heritage properties, buildings, landmarks, and structures. Under the umbrella of the Ontario Heritage Act, oversight is provided by our Heritage Committee, the Municipal Planning Committee, and the Municipal Council. While the impetus for the study seems to be focused on concerns related to high-density development in the subject area, most of these properties have already been developed and are in public ownership or the hands of owners who are committed to their homes. The existing process appears to adequately regulate and cover the need for oversight. What is missing is a commitment by the community and municipal government to assume some responsibility in support of heritage properties beyond simple words and bylaws. Heritage designations are always accompanied with significant increased expense when it comes to repairs and replacement of those aspects of a home's identifying elements that fall within the heritage bylaw. Often these costs can represent multiples of what would normally be required had no designation been in place. These costs often also extend to include hikes in property taxes arising under heritage designations. Municipalities have power under the Ontario Heritage Act to pass bylaws to provide grants for conservation and rehabilitation of designated properties. There are also provisions within the Municipal Act which provide municipalities with means to pass a bylaw to provide for tax relief for owners of heritage properties. Numerous communities in Ontario have used these powers to support owners of heritage homes in their communities. Maybe it's time for Grimsby to do so as well. Also, it seems appropriate for a Heritage Committee to have a reasonable representation of resident owners of heritage homes as members of the committee, or at the very least be required to consult with representative members made up of owners of Grimsby heritage homes on a regular basis in order to fully understand the challenges that are faced by heritage designated property owners. I'll pass it off to my wife.
Good evening. Thank you for allowing us to come forth. A recent article in the Lincoln News noted a comment that Grimsby staff believe they are working in an environment of distrust and misrepresentation when it comes to the Heritage Conservation District study. It would seem to me that the likely cause for this is a lack of communication arising from time restrictions and a desire by administrators to push through a mandate whose implications are not fully understood by those who will be impacted by those decisions. With something as significant as the establishment of a Heritage Conservation District, placing an ad in the local paper, mailing a one-page notice of the HCD study, and communicating with a limited select number of residents who are less inclined to raise concerns suggests that rushing this process is a mistake. This would appear to be a perfect opportunity for the councillors of the affected area to engage with their constituents on this subject. A fulsome engagement with residents should include contacting all of those that fall within the study criteria or are located adjacent to the proposed Heritage Conservation District area for a meeting at the town. At the meeting, municipal staff and council could address issues related to the impact on residents, as well as how the municipality will support and provide relief to those affected by heritage designations, not only with respect to property, but taxes as well. The proposed Heritage Conservation District will affect the community and residents in positive as well as negative ways. It is a big decision that deserves the appropriate time and attention and should not be pushed through because of an arbitrary timeline. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Peter and Sandy. Yeah, sure, if you don't mind. Questions or comments from the committee? Councillor Frick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you both for coming out and doing your presentation. I know it takes a lot to do that, but obviously you have a passion for your home and you feel quite strong about what hasn't been done or in the past, and hopefully this term we can see something more positive happen within the heritage bucket. As I said earlier, I'm not really for me, I'm not really a big proponent of a heritage district. I still believe, and I don't know where this will go, council will discuss it and we'll make a decision, but I believe it needs to be done one-on-one, one at a time. And so I know that the Heritage Group and the Planning Group have a lot more work to do in this area. So hopefully we'll come up with the right decisions. And we will meet with everyone on a one-on-one basis and explain things, as I said earlier, in simple terms. Because, yeah, they're what you get in the mail, one sheet of paper, whatever, this is a Heritage District, and it gives you some stuff that they read, and you probably will come out of that shaking your head, not even knowing what it says. So hopefully going forward, we will do the right thing. I think we have our ears close to the ground on this one. And the last term, I think we learned a lot of lessons from it. And I think it's something we will certainly take a very serious look at and listen to your thoughts and your ideas and your comments. And I really appreciate you coming out, and I speak on behalf of this group, I'm sure. So thank you so much, and let's stay positive. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. And again, I just, in closing, thank you both, Ron and Peter and Sandy. And I do understand your passion, being owner of a house that was built in 1826. I really, I feel every breath that you take in your homes, and I know that there's lots of homeowners out there that feel exactly the same way. And I realize that it is more expensive, maintenance is more expensive, and I really do feel the municipality has to do more to engage actual homeowners, to communicate with homeowners, and to work with homeowners to mitigate the costs. And I'm not speaking of that as a conflict of interest anyway at any point, because it's a benefit for all heritage owners. Homeowners that I feel is necessary just for the fabric and the specialness of the town of Grimsby. After all, we did have the first town meeting in Upper Canada, April 5th, 1790, which was 4 years before Niagara-on-the-Lake. So we certainly owe it to our heritage to protect it and cherish it. So we need a mover and seconder for the resolution. Moved by Councillor Bradsey, second by Councillor Frake. Moved by Councillor Bradsey, second by Councillor Frake. Resolved that the delegations from Ron Van Pelt and Peter and Sandy Zulauf be received. All in favor? That's carried. All right, thank you very much. And up next, we have a discussion report on natural heritage policies. Can we get a mover and seconder to get the item on the floor? Moved by Councillor Bradsey, seconded by Member Drew. And welcome, Terry.
Hi. We just wanted to talk to you about this report. So the province has been updating some of their policies, continuing to update some of them. They released in April a copy of the provincial planning statement right now. They've changed the name of the policy statement to the planning statement. And in the previous version, they did not include the natural heritage policies. So they have now subsequently released the natural heritage policies. And we reviewed them against the existing provincial policy statement, as well as the Greenbelt plan. And sorry, to back up for a moment. The entire intent of the update to the provincial planning statement is to take what is in the growth plan and the provincial policy statement and combine them. With respect to the natural heritage policies, the town of Grimsby is entirely covered by the Greenbelt, so the natural heritage policies of the Greenbelt would really apply for us, more so than the provincial policy statement. So we reviewed them. The definitions look basically the same. Many of the policies are essentially the same. And until the province, they've said that they will be updating the Greenbelt plan. Until we see that, we don't really see any impact by the changes to the natural heritage policy. So this report just basically provides an update to committee and council about that change that they made to the policies. And the comments are due in early August, but there's really not anything we can comment on at this time.
Thank you very much for that update, Terry. Questions or comments from the committee? Seeing none, moved by Councillor Bradzi, second by Member Drew, resolve that report PA 23-25 provincial planning statement, draft natural heritage policies dated July 19th, 2023 be received for information. All in favor? That's carried. We have no correspondence this month. Now, is there any other business pertaining to the committee? From the floor, seeing none. Our next meeting of the Planning and Development Committee is scheduled for August 10th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.